Florence Marryat writes Harriet's character with a mixture that's ambiguous. It's of sympathy and anxiety at the same time, demonstrating Harriet's care for others and innocence of the world. At the same time, Marryat describes her using animal metaphors to emphasize her exoticism, insatiable appetite, and dangerous sexuality. But Harriet's status as a monster is never really Marryat still could not justify Harriet's suicide without turning her into a monster, even though it's inadvertent of those she becomes closest to. Marryat thus cautions women against too much passion, in addition to all the other ills that Harriet embodies. But her status as a monster is never really confirmed, but remains an assumption put forward by the male doctor character, the emissary of patriarchal rule, seeking to put an out-of-place woman back where she belongs. Victorian society was full of out-of-place women, and many of the struggles for women's rights in this period mirror the ones happening now in our own. Domestic abuse, rape culture, racial profiling, and the legislation of women's bodies are all bits of context that come to mind, and ones that cross race and gender barriers, necessitating the inclusive feminist approach to game design that I'm advocating. Turning Harriet's struggles to understand her own identity in Victorian England into a game that foregrounds player decision-making is one way to approach those current issues and bring them up without being overtly preachy or didactic. I hope. I have a problem with the way we teach English. First, let me be clear, there's nothing wrong with reading books and writing papers. But our society has become steeped in digital media, and both scholarship and pedagogy at the university level have to change to address this shift or risk becoming obsolete. Educational institutions have to become more electorate. In terms of what we teach, recognizing how texts jump boundaries between media and what happens when they do is one way to accomplish this. Such texts are called transmediations. And my video game is one of them. It takes the novel and continues its story in another genre, a digital genre. Other examples include The Walking Dead, Game of Thrones, and the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, which will pop up here in a second. Teaching texts that make these jumps with either the same or new content and characters is a valuable way to encourage students to think creatively, to imagine ways to remix, appropriate, or reinterpret texts. They start to think heuritically, playfully. And that brings us to composition. We no longer compose with words. We use images, videos, and sound as effective ways to communicate to our audiences. And we should be teaching students to do this too, not only in composition courses, but also in literature and rhetoric courses and across the curriculum. And scholars should compose this way too. I want to specifically advocate for the design and production of video games as approaches to scholarship. I understand that some will take this as a call to make games that are like articles, which is fine, but I hope they also make games that are more subtle and take good design practices into consideration. If scholars can learn to design better PowerPoints and InDesign documents, this shouldn't be too much of a stretch, though it will probably mean that collaboration becomes more of a necessity, which is great because collaboration ought to be more widely encouraged in humanities disciplines. We get a lot more out of talking to each other than holing up in our offices and trying to say something brilliant alone. I've chosen to break up my dissertation into 4 chapters. The first focuses on game design and rhetorical theory, the second on feminism, the third on female characters, particularly the female monster, and the fourth will be about the game itself. These chapters serve to ground the game in rhetorical practices standard to our discipline and will contextualize my design choices for the game. I've called Chapter 1 Game Design because the reason I decided to make a game in the first place was based on my concerns about subject positions in video games. Reading so much theory from Heidegger, Greg Ulmer, Roland Barthes, and Kenneth Burke scholars who all deal with identity formation in various ways, gave me grounds to criticize the shallowness of the vast majority of games' subject positions and their limited utilization of the infinite conceptual possibilities of digital spaces. In this chapter, I begin with the possibility of applying Heidegger's concept of Dasein, being, to video gamers and their avatars, also touching on ideas of thrownness and worldhood, applying them to digital game spaces. I used Miguel Siekart's work on video game ethics to explore how these concepts might best manifest as game mechanics. And I traced the history of theories of play up to Ulmer's heuretics, which serves as an ideal approach to game design because of its flexibility and acknowledgement of the co-creation of meaning between text and writer and reader. And yes, that is Kevin Spacey. Chapter 2 begins with a brief history of feminism with a focus on second-wave French feminists Cixous, Irigaray, and Kristeva. I question the idea of female or bisexual writing, but take their emphasis on interiority, irrationality, and fluidity and think about them as approaches to game design. I use Black feminist writers Bell Hooks, Angela Davis, and Audre Lorde to introduce theories central to my approach to designing a character for whom race is a central issue. And I propose that inclusive feminism is the only ethical feminism, both in challenging the ordinary world of female gamers and in the design of games for all audiences. Acknowledging and addressing gender and racial difference, rather than treating them as non-issues, are central to my idea of ethical game design.
Can't shoot him. Too much noise.
Let's take him.
I like your style.
Chapter 3 is substantial. I begin by discussing archetypes of female characters, starting with ancient folklore, moving up through literature, film, and television. I compare Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces to Carl Jung's psychological archetypes, and then consider what must be changed about these archetypes to address female difference, using work by Clarissa Pinkola Estes and Valerie Frankel. I focus on the archetype of the crone, plus Kristeva's essay on abjection, to open conversation about female monsters. I will analyze Marriott's monstrous female protagonist in the context of Victorian imperialism and Gothic and sensation literature. I will discuss the women's movement of the turn of the 20th century and then trace the trope of the female monster, particularly the female vampire, into today's pop culture. Noting that ambiguous female monsters are becoming more prevalent in film and television, but remain almost entirely absent from games, I argue for the value in video game designers exploring the female monster as potential heroine. And here's Jessica from True Blood.
This isn't about strategy or tactics. This is about survival.
Coming after.
Tell your friends we're coming for them.
It's kind of how I feel. All right, and chapter 4. Chapter 4 is the companion work to the game itself. So first I want you guys to watch a brief demonstration. We've made a little video of gameplay of what we have so far. So I'll just let you take that one.